Let me start again, though, and just welcome you all to the next in our Jewish Renaissance and Lions Learning series. So this series has been called Spies, Lies and Unsung Heroes. Spies, Lies and Secret Missions, the Unsung Heroes, Jewish Unsung Heroes of World War II. And it's a joint collaboration between Jewish Renaissance magazine and the Lions Learning Project, and has been curated by Monica Bohm-Duchesne from Insiders Outsiders Festival, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment. As a whole series, we've been looking at the contributions of Jews to the war effort. Often so much of the narrative around the Holocaust is about the stories of Jewish victims. And while that is an incredibly important narrative to tell, what we've tried to focus on in this series is the Jewish contribution to the efforts of rescue and the efforts of resistance. We're especially looking at refugees. So the subtitle of the Insiders Outsiders Festival that Monica runs is Refugees from Nazi Europe and their contribution to British culture. And we've looked a lot up till this week at those refugees from Nazi Germany who come to Britain and contributed to Britain. Tonight we're doing a slightly different story. Tonight is also about a refugee from Nazi Germany, Wilfrid Israel, but it's about his contribution not just to British culture, but to Israeli culture and to an international rescue effort. We're going to be looking at his story through the documentary film that many of you may have already watched. We did send out the link in advance, and we're hoping a little bit later on to have the film's director, Yonatan Nir, joining us. And I want to start off by having a little think about who Wilfrid Israel was and telling you how I came to this film and came to suggest it to Monica when she was curating the content of this evening. Because about 5 years ago, I was invited to a film evening at Chelsea Synagogue, and this documentary was shown. And I was there with a colleague and friend, and both of us had been lecturing on Holocaust literature at university for many, many years. And neither of us had heard of Wilfrid Israel. So the first shock of the evening watching the film was quite how much he'd done, how known he was at the time. And yet there was this question which was, and yet why didn't we know about him in the same way we know about other rescuers? We know about the Schindlers, or for example, we know about Dr. Solomon Schonfeld and his involvement in the Kindertransport. So that for me was shock number one and made me think Wilfrid Israel is someone we really must explore more about. My next shock though was suddenly someone I knew came up on screen. And I'd known Dr. Jonathan Oppenheimer for several years actually by that point. I knew his sons, I taught some of them in Cheder. I knew his wife, Merav, and yet I always knew Jonathan as Jonathan. It wasn't until watching the film that I found out that it was actually Jonathan Wilfrid. And what I'm going to do to start us off is bring Dr. Jonathan Oppenheimer on screen to explain why he's named Jonathan Wilfrid, how he came to know more about Wilfrid Israel, and how he came to be interviewed in the film The Essential Link, which Yonatan Nir directed. So thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan. And welcome to you. Thank you for this evening. I'm going to ask you to start by telling everyone else in the audience the story you told me about how you came to be involved in this film.
Well, my second name is Wilfrid. Due to a bureaucratic error when my birth was registered, or when my name was registered, mine is spelt Wilfred, E-D, whereas Wilfrid Israel's is ID, which I think is actually probably the proper spelling for Wilfrid. But anyway, When I was a kid at prep school, having a German name was a disadvantage. Being a Jew, in the eyes of some, was a disadvantage. And when my fellow pupils found out that my second name was Wilfrid, that proved to be a further disadvantage, because for some reason, Wilfrid wasn't considered, the word cool wasn't really used back then, but it wasn't cool. So I went home and said to my parents, for goodness sake, of all the names you could have chosen, why Wilfrid? And my father told me that I should be proud to be called Wilfrid, and I was called Wilfrid for two people. One of them was my father's youngest cousin, who was his favorite cousin. He didn't have a brother, and this kid, when they were growing up, was the nearest thing he had to a brother, and his name was Wolfgang Portner. When they came as refugees to the UK, they both ended up interned on the Isle of Man initially, and then they both, and we'll come back to this in a minute, they both got out of the Isle of Man and went into the army, into the Pioneer Corps, which is where Jews generally ended up, or at least where Jews generally began. And after a while, they both went their separate ways, and Wolfgang went into the tanks. And he was told that Wolfgang Portner wasn't a really good name either for a young trooper in the tank regiment. So he served as Wilfrid Porter and was shot by a sniper from the church spire, the church tower, in a little village called Canat, outside Amiens. And he was, as I said, my father's favorite cousin. So that was one reason. And the other reason, which is more relevant today, is that in the spring of 1933, my father had gone to a cabaret or music hall with a friend of his, a guy called Walter Kocherthaler. And on their way back, nice spring evening, not a care in the world except that Germany was going to the dogs, they encountered a group of SA thugs. And my father told his friend Walter, who was a bit diminutive, to run for it. And my dad, who was an exceptionally strong person and was into judo and so on, was determined to put up a fight. And he must have put up quite an effective fight, because he eventually got away. But in the fracas, he dropped his wallet. And in his wallet, there was some form of ID. I don't know what it amounted to, but there was something to identify him. And he made his way home, pretty battered. And the next day, a very close friend of the family, a man called Wilfrid Israel, phoned my grandfather and said, you have to get Hans out of Germany immediately. Absolutely no time to delay, because he's on a list to be arrested. And the first thing they'll do is they will let the people that he punched have their way with him. And he's very unlikely to come out of that alive. And so my father was immediately dispatched to London. And at that point, it seems, in spring of 1933, that wasn't particularly difficult. But he left alone, initially leaving the rest of his family behind. And I remember when I was first told this story, and I said this in the film, my first question was, how did he know? And why did you take this seriously? I mean, if somebody, as a kid, I didn't really appreciate, but now I certainly do appreciate what it would mean to leave your home, to leave your parents, to leave everything behind, not knowing when you're going to see anybody again, just because somebody tells you you're on a list to be arrested. And my father said that at the time, they really didn't know how Wilfrid knew. They simply knew that he did know, that he knew much more about what was going on than other people, and that if he said something, you believed it. So my father left, and that was it. He didn't go back to Germany. He told me that much later, and by the way, one little correction. I mean, Wilfrid didn't really come to England as a refugee because he was a British citizen. He had dual nationality. His grandfather was Chief Rabbi Adler, the first United Synagogue chief rabbi, and he was born in London. He was bilingual and a dual citizen. And eventually he did end up back in the UK, and he and my father met again. And he then explained to my father that he had been working with British intelligence in Berlin since 1928. This seems to be borne out by the biography of Frank Foley, who is the sort of senior British intelligence person working officially as a passport officer in Berlin. And the only other, I mean, so why was Wilfrid a friend of my father's family? He was the scion of the Israel family who owned this big department store, as everyone knows. He was an unlikely businessman, although he seems to be quite an effective one. He really wanted to be a sculptor. And my grandfather was a painter and was one of the sort of go-to people for portraits in Berlin, in sort of Berlin society in those days. And my grandfather painted several members of the Israel family. And it was through that, I think, that they first got to know each other. And Wilfrid became a regular visitor at my grandparents' apartment because he and my grandfather, apart from my grandfather being an artist, they both shared, in particular, a love of Far Eastern art and Far Eastern sculpture. In London, in England, my father ended up not being able to find work in London and ended up through another connection, because my grandfather had painted Sir Ernest Oppenheimer, who was the chairman of Anglo-American mining in De Beers in South Africa. And so my father, sort of ending up penniless in London, was about actually to go back to Berlin. I mean, he just didn't know what to do. And my grandfather telegraphed Sir Ernest Oppenheimer, who he knew was still in London. My grandfather had made a painting trip to London, had a number of commissions, and he telegraphed him, and he agreed to find passage for my father to South Africa and work for him there. He didn't remain very long. He came back to England. And when war broke out, he volunteered. But before he could get into the army, he was instead interned on the Isle of Man as an enemy alien. And it was Wilfrid Israel visiting the internment camps in the Isle of Man who actually got my father out of there and enabled him to join the army.
Wow,
and really,
that's part of the story I didn't know, and really interesting because we had a little series actually at the beginning of September, October about the Isle of Man and what internment there really meant, because it's the 80th anniversary, and in fact in March of 2022, Insiders, Outsiders and Jewish Renaissance are taking a group to the Isle of Man with the Association of Jewish Refugees to put up a blue plaque to commemorate the internment, because there hasn't been one until now. And we've talked during that series, we talked about all the ways that, first of all, the people were interned who shouldn't have been interned, but also how people got released, and often it was because they were selected for some kind of very specific army training, either because of their languages or as commandos. But you're telling us that actually it was the sway that Wilfrid Israel had, that he did that for your father.
Yes, I do. I mean, it may well be that he got other people out of there as well. But because what had happened to my father was that by that time, his English was good. He'd been in South Africa speaking English for some years. He'd been back in England for a year or so, maybe a year and a half. So when he was initially interned, he said he was very quickly put in the camp intelligence office as an interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
So he said to his bosses there, well, you obviously don't think I'm a fifth columnist. Please let me join the army. Mm-hmm. And their response was, do you have any military experience, Mr. Oppenheimer? And my father said, no. So they said, well, in that case, you're probably more useful to us here, which didn't please him at all. And so he was very keen to get out of there. He went into the Pioneer Corps and then became one of the, I think, virtually a founder member of REME, Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, because he had trained as an engineer at AEG in Berlin. And engineering was one of the first occupations for Jews to be excluded. So that didn't last very long. And he was actually out of work. I mean, that was another good reason for not hanging about when told that he had to leave.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure people are going to have many questions for you, which reminds me just to say to everyone, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A at the end. So please do put your questions in the chat, or let us know later on by raising your virtual hand, and we will bring you up to ask questions of Jonathan, and hopefully, if we get him to, Yonatan Nir, the director. But I want to move on because, so Wilfrid Israel helped your father twice. Your father, as you say, was one of his friends. I mean, Wilfrid Israel seems to have many friends and have moved in quite an exalted circle. Other people who are mentioned in the film are Gandhi, for example, Einstein. There is someone that I will come to a little bit later, which is Christopher Isherwood as well. I mean, was your father or your father's family part of that same circle, or was it that Wilfrid Israel had a specific genius for making friends?
I think he probably did have a genius for making friends, but I think that Berlin, and specifically Jewish Berlin, was quite I mean, it's a big city, but in a way it was probably quite a village. And I mean, the friendship with Einstein, for instance, was shared by my grandfather as well. I mean, Einstein was the shadchan for my aunt and uncle, and when my father played truant from school and fell behind in his maths, my grandfather, first of all, got hold of actually somebody who was Freud's nephew to tutor my father, and that worked out very badly indeed. An awful experience for my dad, and so that didn't last. And the next choice, my grandfather asked his friend Albert if he could help, and of course, schoolboy maths wasn't really his thing. But I have 6 pages of formulae which he wrote out for my father, of trying to explain to him, presumably work that he was doing at the time. And I've shown these pages to, what's his name? Brian Cox, to Brian Cox, and he couldn't make head or tail of them. But my youngest son, Dan, reckons that he does know what they're about, so I don't.
Hey, Dad.
But so that, you know, that was, I mean, this is not for the purpose of name dropping, it's simply to illustrate that I think that it was quite a tight circle. And there's one thing that I would take slight issue with what Naomi Shepherd says on the film, where she says that although we think of Berlin as this kind of bohemian free-for-all place, bourgeois Jewish Berlin wouldn't have been like that and would have been very intolerant of Wilfrid Israel's homosexuality. I'm sure that's true of much of bourgeois society and much of society, whether in Berlin or elsewhere in the 1930s and beyond. But it wasn't universally true. And certainly my grandparents and my father were well aware of Wilfrid's homosexuality and were not the least bit bothered about it. My grandparents were, because there was, that bohemian Berlin also was very, very strongly Jewish. And people like my grandfather, who was a society portrait painter on the one hand, that's how he earned his living. But he was quite a bohemian character on the other hand, and spent his free time in sort of kind of liberal Berlin society. He and Einstein shared an enjoyment of going to music hall together. And so I think he felt relatively relaxed in that environment. Certainly, as I say, I mean, there was no doubt in my family's mind about Wilfrid's sexuality, and nobody was bothered by it. The family thought that he probably fancied my dad, who was quite a handsome young man. My father didn't entirely share his parents' totally kind of free-thinking attitude. My father certainly had many of the prejudices of his generation. But whenever he expressed, as he sometimes did, unkind thoughts about homosexuality, he always almost slapped his own wrist and said, but my friend Wilfrid was one of the finest people I ever knew. And he would say, well, and if he did fancy me, he never behaved inappropriately. That was, but so yeah, I think that Wilfrid Israel certainly had access to to the great and the good, and had the resources to travel widely, which was to a degree that was unusual in those days.
So let's just take that on a little bit. I'm going to both go radically forward and then backtrack, because one of the things that one of the questions this documentary poses is why Wilfrid Israel isn't remembered and isn't known as widely as he should be. And the documentary itself questions about, is part of it the guilt of the survivors? Those he saved felt guilty about the people who weren't saved, and is he associated with that? But it does also pose that question about, and to what extent it is because of his sexuality. And there's this really interesting moment with Christopher Isherwood, where Christopher Isherwood, who had been very open about his own sexuality, because Isherwood is the author of the stories that Cabaret is based on, and he, Ord and Spender, we now know were quite involved. They left Berlin, but they were quite involved in the underground at different points in time and helping people get out. So there's a whole other story there, but Christopher Isherwood says that he wasn't kind to Wilfrid in his early writing because he saw Wilfrid as repressed, and he thought that Wilfrid was threatened by how open Isherwood was about his own sexuality. And like 35 years later, he very much regretted it, that he hadn't been kinder to Wilfrid Israel. So I thought that seemed for me quite interesting, because on the one hand, Naomi Shepherd, Israel's biographer, is speculating, that he was judged by the Jewish community for being gay. and it seemed like he was being judged by the literati for not being openly gay enough. So he seems, on the one hand, like to know everybody and be friendly with anybody, but also everybody and anybody, but also to be quite a lonely figure. How much does that portrayal in the documentary chime with what you know from your family?
Yeah, I think it chimes very well. My father, I mean, first of all, I have to say, I don't know how much my family knew, because my father died in 94 and my grandparents much, long before that. I don't know whether they knew anything about Wilfrid's very extensive other activities in saving thousands of Jews. I really hope that my father did know that, because, and maybe he did, I really don't know. Because if he didn't, I'm sure he certainly suffered from survivor guilt. And I always thought that it was specifically about other members of his own family who didn't survive, and in particular, his beloved grandmother who didn't survive. But if he had known, but I think that there may have also been an element that he thought that Wilfrid had saved him and stuck his neck out to tell my grandfather that he knew that Wilfrid was on a list. And that was sticking his neck out, because that immediately raised the question, how the hell, the question I asked as a kid, how the hell did this man know who was on a Gestapo list for arrest? Mm-hmm. By exposing the fact that he knew, he was certainly endangering himself and endangering the work that he presumably was engaged in with Foley and so on. So I think my father also felt guilty at thinking that he had been saved just because he was a friend. And if he knew that many, many other people who were total strangers to Wilfrid Israel had been saved by him, equally selflessly, then that would have been a good thing. But I think as far as Wilfrid's isolation, yes, I mean, I didn't know very much about him other than, what he was in the eyes of my family. And certainly they saw him as a lonely figure and an unhappy person. I mean, not a very happy person, partly because certainly in much of the world in which he moved, he did have to repress his homosexuality. It's all right for a Bohemian Jewish painter to accept it. It certainly wouldn't have been the case for many of the customers of Israel or many of the staff. And he had to also operate as a conventional businessman at a period when that would have been seen as incompatible.
Absolutely. So let's just contextualize this, because I know there are a few people in the audience who haven't yet watched the film. I've had a couple of messages. So Israel was his family's business. So Wilfrid himself is passionate about art and will become an extensive art collector, which we'll go on to talk about in a moment. But he wasn't allowed or wasn't able to have that creative career that I think he would have wanted, because the expectation on him was to go into the family business and run it. And Israel was, from what I understand, it was the biggest department store in Berlin, and right opposite the Rathaus, right opposite the town hall. Yeah.
I don't know whether it was bigger than KaDeWe, but it was certainly very large, and it was certainly the longest established.
The oldest.
One thing that is said in the film, which is a mistranslation, one of the German participants says that En Israel and 3 other companies I think he mentions were the initiators of confectionery. He didn't mean confectionery, he meant confection, he meant ready-to-wear clothing. That which was one of the big things that department stores brought in. The roots of modern fashion. Before ready-made clothes were available at an affordable price, fashion was the purlieu of the very rich. And so businesses like Selfridges in London and Israel in Berlin were at the root of the development of modern fashion.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. You just made that comparison with Selfridges. Before you said that, I'd just been about to compare it to John Lewis, but Selfridges is definitely classier. The reason I've been going to go with John Lewis is because the thing that John Lewis was famous for was how well it looked after its employees. And whereas at the beginning, possibly Wilfrid Israel might have slightly resented that he had to take charge of the department store rather than indulging his art career, it feels like as soon as the 30s hit that he began to know from Frank Foley and others what was going on. In fact, he himself was imprisoned and tortured for a night in 33. So he very, very early saw how ruthless the Nazis would be. And
just after he sent my dad out of the country, actually, literally within, there's probably only a few weeks between those two events.
Okay, so that might have been one of the triggers to him trying to protect your father, because he knew. That's really interesting. But what I was going to say was, it seemed like that flicked a switch in him, that moment, that night of imprisonment, in that he went from someone who suddenly saw running this company rather than as a responsibility. I mean, it was a huge responsibility, but also it was an opportunity, that he took the responsibility to his Jewish employees seriously, and he was going to use his power and his money and his influence as a way to get as many of those Jewish employees to safety as possible. And many of those people, many of the people he was imprisoned with for that night and tortured with for that night in 33, and many of those employees went to Israel, well, Palestine as it was then, with Wilfrid Israel's help and Frank Foley's help at getting them visas. And I believe it was through that Israel connection that you actually later on came to discover more about him and then be connected to the film. So will you tell us a bit about what happened there?
Yeah, I didn't know anything about this Wilfrid Israel Museum, or, as I say, I knew nothing about Wilfrid Israel's role in the Kindertransport or the rescue of thousands of Jews. And Marav, my wife, and I were having lunch with a very old friend of hers, somebody she hadn't seen for about 30 years. So it was a very emotional occasion for her and this other woman. And they were nattering away. I was talking to the husband, and suddenly I heard the name Wilfrid Israel mentioned by the wife, who, as it turned out, was telling my wife, you must go and visit this fascinating little museum just down the road from here in Kibbutz Hazorea. I've been there. I never knew it was there, and I've been there the other day, and it's absolutely fascinating because I'm doing a course on the Holocaust. This was a woman originally from Iraq, so not from the European Jewish communities, and I pricked up my ears. I said, Wilfrid Israel, what's this all about? And my first thought was there must be another Wilfrid Israel, but anyway, it was clear when she described his death that we're talking about the same Wilfrid Israel. And so we went straight after lunch with them. We went off to Kibbutz Hazorea, which is indeed just down the road from Tivon, where this couple live. And the museum was closed. And so we were about to turn tail when a door opened and a lady came out, obviously seeing strange people approaching the museum, turning away. And she said, can I help you? And I said, well, apparently not, the museum's closed. And she said, well, why? Is there anything especially that brings you to the museum? And I said, well, just my second name is Wilfrid. And she said, that sounds to me, it sounds as if there's a story behind that, and it sounds like a good enough reason to open the museum for you. So we had a private tour of the museum. She asked me why my second name was Wilfrid. And after that, she said there was somebody who might like to talk to me. because she knew that there was somebody who was born on the kibbutz who was going to be making a film about, I think a short film had already been made, the short film that Yonatan made originally, and that they were talking about making a longer film. And that was it. And then I got a phone call, I think, or an email, and I was invited. I think it was actually on a subsequent visit. I don't think that was on the same visit to Israel, but the next time we were there, that I was I was interviewed by Yonatan.
So we think that Yonatan has actually got the time difference with Israel mixed up, and we're not sure that he's going to be able to make it. So I'm going to ask.
But he got it the wrong way round.
I think so.
My wife does that all the time.
And I believe Marav just flew back from Israel today, so who knows what time zone she's in at the moment. If you're listening, Marav, it's lovely to have you too here. But what I was going to say to you is the question I was going to ask him, maybe I'll ask you, because the fact that Yonatan is making this film, for those who have seen it, you will see there is a very personal connection with him as well, that it was his grandfather who came across on the advice of Wilfrid Israel, came to Palestine. And his grandfather actually didn't get out till 1939. And Wilfrid's message to him basically was flee now. And he ran and left his father behind, and his father didn't survive, and he very unlikely wouldn't have either. But what Yonatan Nir begins to uncover as he's trying to explore his grandfather's story is that this kibbutz has this museum that is called Wilfrid House. I mean, at that point, pre the film, the objects that will get displayed from Wilfrid's art collection, they'll get displayed from the museum or still in the basement, I believe. But he lives on this, he grows up on this kibbutz, and he knows about Wilfrid House. He never knows who Wilfrid Israel is. And then as he begins to research, he's discovering that it isn't just his own grandfather, but it's most of the kibbutz that had been saved or got visas by Wilfrid Israel and Captain Foley, and are there. So pretty much that whole kibbutz, all the children and grandchildren are alive because of Wilfrid Israel. And what he begins to explore with the documentary is that culture of silence. But that culture of silence seems to have changed following this documentary. I mean, did you, when you were there, hear any stories of the other people, or in the making of the documentary, did more come out that you hadn't known about Wilfrid Israel?
Yes, I mean, my involvement in the documentary was minute. It was just being interviewed by Jonathan. So I can't say that I know any more than anyone else watching the film. Certainly the whole thing, the extent of this man's activity was completely new to me. And that's why I say that I wonder whether anybody in my family knew or had any idea. He was certainly a very private man. I'm sure he never sought the limelight. He clearly didn't do any of the things that he did in order to be glorified, he just did what had to be done. But in doing what had to be done, sorry, this is slightly slipping away from your question. But one of the things that does come out of the film and comes out of Naomi Shepherd's book to some extent as well, is that, which is partly the answer to why is he so little known. He was clearly a completely pragmatic person. He did what had to be done to achieve what needed to be achieved, which was saving people. And if it meant negotiating with Nazis, he negotiated with Nazis. And this is, I think, as much and perhaps more than his homosexuality or any of the other causes, the reason that he hasn't been recognized, as the film says, there are no streets in Israel called Wilfrid Israel Street. I think that it is the fact, there this ideal of people being saved by armed action, by partisans, or by being simply rescued from under the noses of the Nazis. The fact that in real practical terms, it was impossible to get vast numbers of people out without negotiation and without payment of money I mean, it's undeniable, but it certainly wasn't part of the kind of heroic narrative. And I think that's, you know, if he had been seeking glory, you know, he would maybe have done things differently and been much less effective.
I mean, there's something else. I think absolutely everything you've said is correct. And there's something else I'd like to add to it before maybe beginning to tie up and opening to the audience. And that is, for me, one of the things that's really interesting is Wilfrid Israel potentially has two safe places as options. I mean, all his friends from his youth work and youth group in Jewish youth group in Germany are now in Israel. We also have the fact that he has this British passport and he has a life in Britain. And I mean, if we look at Israel, I mean, his friends include Chaim Weizmann, you know, he wouldn't have had a problem settling there. In Britain, when he comes over to Britain, he ends up working for a little bit with Bloomsbury House, the Association for Jewish Refugees. We know he's got this relationship with the British Secret Service. And yet, he takes neither of those safe options, but he keeps going back to Germany. And what happens post Kristallnacht is that no Anglo-Jew will go back to have those conversations, but Wilfrid Israel will go back. And I think Yonatan, who I'm really delighted to say we actually do have joining us, so I'm going to bring on screen. Yonatan mentions in the film, I think you describe it as him going back to the inferno. So I think maybe, Jonathan, shall we let Yonatan answer that one? And welcome very much, Yonatan. And then we'll talk a little bit to Yonatan and then we'll open up to the audience.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, lovely to have you with us. We're so glad you were able to join us despite the time difference. We've been talking with Jonathan about Wilfrid Israel's history, his work at the Israel department store, and we were just beginning to explore this return. You know, he gets people out to the kibbutz where your family are now from. He gets people out to Britain, but he keeps returning, as you say in the film, to the inferno. What is he doing in the late 30s and early 40s at that point, and why do you think that he's driven to go back?
So we know that he left Germany around March or April of 1939, and he went to England. But as you said, he's going back in July or August to take care of the last Kindertransport trains. And by the way, today is 2nd of December. This is exactly 83 years from the first transport, if I'm not wrong. And why is he going back? Why is he taking all these risks to save people that he doesn't know? I think that he was just a very special human being who cared a lot about other people. It started many years before. You know, we have some accounts of his work with in Germany with the Quakers, after the First World War, in, you know, the very bad situation that was there in Germany after the war, and he's there to help people to try to make the life easier for people that suffers a lot. He has done it all his life. You know, when he was the owner of this big department store we heard from so many people that were connected to were the children or grandchildren of the employees. We heard so many stories about, how much he cared about people. I just think that he was a very special and very sensitive human being. He was very sensitive to the suffering of others, and he wanted to help as many people as possible. I think that he actually suffered a lot from that because he realized that he cannot help everyone, and he actually writes about it in his letters that he would not want his his work to be known. He want to keep this, let's keep these things that happened here for ourselves. And he always felt, I think, that he did not do enough. He always wanted to do more for other people.
Wow. So in talking about what he did or didn't do, you mentioned a word that I've been being quite careful with till now, and maybe it's the last thing to talk about before we do bring our audience in, and that's the Kindertransport, because I think we need to be a little bit careful about how we phrase it. The Kindertransport was a complicated and important piece of our history that many people were involved in. But Wilfrid Israel did have a significant impact and was a key person who was involved with the Kindertransport, particularly working from the German side. Will you tell us a little bit about his involvement in the Kindertransport and what happened when you included that in the film?
Sure, but before that, I wanna say thank you to Nomi Shepherd, who wrote the book Wilfrid Israel, German Jewry's Secret Ambassador, in the beginning of the 80s. Without her, there is no chance that we would be able to make this film, because she actually made an enormous research. When people that actually knew Wilfrid Israel were still alive to speak with her, about 60 or 70 people, she interviewed about 60 or 70 people that could tell her stories about this man. When I tried to find people who actually knew Wilfrid Israel, and after a very long journey, 6 years in the making of this film, we could find only 2 people that could tell us about him, that knew him as kids. But Nomi did make this amazing research even before the term Kindertransport existed. So what we know about the Kindertransport is that the idea for that operation, and you're right, there were hundreds of people that were involved in that. But the idea for this operation started in Germany, because nobody in England could understand how difficult is the situation. In fact, the British administration did not believe that the situation is so bad. And when Wilfrid Israel, that was very connected to Lord Herbert Samuel, it was actually Lord Herbert Samuel that was in England at the time, part of the German Jewry. I forgot the name of the organization. It will come back to me in a second. But they tried to lobby, for the German Jews in Germany, and he contacted the Lord Herbert Samuel with the offer, to get children out of Germany without their parents. This idea is something that Wilfrid Israel has dealt with years before, because from 31, 32, 33, Wilfrid Israel is involved in the Yonatan Nir organization that takes children from Germany to Palestine, to Eretz Israel, without their parents. So the idea of, separating children from the parents and bringing them to a new place was not new to Wilfrid Israel, but for the British Parliament, it was so crazy that when this idea came to the Parliament, at first they said, this is impossible. We don't believe that families in Germany are willing to part from the children. It doesn't make any sense. So they actually sent the Quakers, a Quaker delegation to Germany, 16th of November. That's when they left London. They were supposed to meet Wilfrid Israel in Amsterdam, but he could not arrive. So they continued to Berlin. This is all documented. We have documents for official documents, government documents. The Quakers arrived to Berlin. At the time, it's right after Kristallnacht. 30,000 Jews are in concentration camps. Most of them are men. So basically, Wilfrid Israel bring these 5 or 6 Quakers to meet the women organizations around Germany, so they can hear how difficult is the situation. I mean, this is a time where there's so many people, so many Jews commit suicide because the situation is so terrible. And they convince the Quakers that this is something that actually can happen, that the women will, put their children on a train and say goodbye. Then the Quakers come back to Britain, and the Minister of Interior is, I think, Samuel Hoare, that was his name, and he was a Quaker himself. And then he brings it to the Parliament, and they approve it. So that is the importance of the role. And then, on the 2nd of December, the first train goes out. So this is why Wilfrid Israel was so important. He had the connection with the Quakers from the 20s. He had the connection with Lord Herbert Samuel and with Chaim Weizmann that approached the Parliament. And he was the one who actually showed the Quakers helped them meet the women organization and convince them that this is possible. It might be that there are more things that he did for this operation that we don't know, like someone had to communicate with the Nazis. Someone had to make sure that these trains will go out peacefully from Germany and cross the border. And we know that Wilfrid Israel has very, very strong connection in the Nazi administration at the time. So that's the importance of this man. But we don't say he did it alone. We don't say there were hundreds of people that were involved in that, but he definitely played a key role. He was the essential link for this operation.
Which is the title of your film, The Essential Link. And of course, so just to pick up, you earlier were talking about Herbert Samuel. I think possibly, do you mean the Council for German Jewry, which was the group that worked with Neville, well, I'm not sure working with is the right name, but they're a group who went to Neville Chamberlain and tried to talk to him about what was happening and convince him, though, I mean, exactly as we've seen with what happened with the Dubs rule recently, British Parliament was not as keen on taking refugees then as it is now. So he took quite a lot of talking into, and there were several other British politicians who really pushed it. But yeah, but Herbert Samuel was very keen.
Can I just say something to corroborate the amount of ignorance in the UK at the time? My grandmother, who was a feisty woman, was so fed up with how little understanding there was in Britain. She and my grandfather finally also got out. In their case, probably not thanks to Wilfrid. It was their only son had already left, and my grandfather painted the great and the good in Britain as much as he had in Germany, and was quite a sort of Anglophile. In the end, his Zionism was probably more important. It got in the way of his Anglophilism. But anyway, my grandmother, they got to Britain, I think, in 1935, and she was really fed up. But because of his connections, they got British nationality very, very quickly. My grandfather was sponsored by Louis Grieg, who was George VI's equerry, and Sir John Lavery, who was the portrait painter of the day. So they got British nationality very quickly. My father didn't. My father served in the army throughout the war and was not made a British national until 2 years after I was born, in 1949. So, because they told him that his military service didn't count for citizenship, you had to be a civilian. Anyway, my grandmother was very fed up, and she decided in either late 38 or very early 39 to go back to Berlin with her new British passport, and taking with her the wife of the then head of the Sainsbury family, who, again, my grandfather painted Sainsbury's, and she became very friendly with this lady, and they traveled to Berlin together. And my grandmother told me that her two purposes were, she thought it would be extra protection for her to have this rather grand English lady with her, but also, even more important, she wanted this grand English lady to see for herself just what was happening, because people would believe her when they got home. And her other purpose was to try to get her own mother, my great-grandmother, out of Berlin. My great-grandmother refused to budge, and so it was her decision to stay. But they came back. One of the little stories my grandmother liked to tell was their departure from Berlin to come back to London. Of course, this Sainsbury lady didn't travel other than in first class. So they're sitting in a first class compartment, and two Nazi officers enter the compartment and sit down, saying hello very politely and so on. And as the train pulls out of the station, they say, what a relief it is not to have to share one's compartment with Jews anymore. And my grandmother felt the Sainsbury lady's hand grasping hers to sort of keep your mouth shut.
Gosh.
That was it.
Which really talks about, I mean, that story is so important on both levels, isn't it? It's reminding us again exactly how much resistance there was in Britain to taking the plight of the German Jews seriously, but also what important work Wilfrid Israel had to do in Berlin in that period to facilitate Jews getting visas and getting out, and not just kind of working with the Nazis, who must have, I mean, it must have been excruciating working with these people to try and make things happen and biting his tongue constantly, but also trying to convince the German Jews that they really did need to leave and that they needed to take it seriously too. So it was a very complicated job that he did. Look, I could interview the two of you all night, and I will come back to Yonatan at the end, but we do have people who would like to ask questions, and we've only got about 15 minutes left. So let me start by bringing Angela Gluck up, who has a question for you.
Yes, thank you. Yonatan, I loved your film. I really enjoyed it very much. Thank you. And part of what you did was hint at some of the reasons why Wilfrid has not been recognized. No, you mentioned no streets, and it struck me. Yeah, there are no streets named after him. But you do give a few clues, I think, as to why on the kibbutz he's not talked about, or he hasn't been talked about. And yet there is the naming of the house, you know. And so I wondered, could you say a little bit more what you think would be the reasons for this this mystery, or maybe this even a conspiracy of silence? I'm not sure. I wasn't sure exactly what you were saying, if you think it's actually an active decision not to speak about him, or no, you're not saying that. Okay, so tell me.
I don't think it was an active decision. I think there was so much pain that, you know, imagine yourself living in a kibbutz, a very small kibbutz, with 100 people living in tents. And they start to get information in the late 38, the beginning of 39, about you know, about the Kristallnacht, about what's going on with the Jews. You know, the kibbutz members, you know, they are young people. They're 20, 21, 22. They have some money that was sent to them by their parents, or they brought with them from Germany, but the parents are still there, you know, and they need to make a decision how they prioritize who's going to go out first, who's going to go out second, who's going to go out next year. And when I went to the archive in the kibbutz, and you can see it in the film, you can actually see how they sit week by week, and they make these impossible decisions, you know. And in this process, there were some dramatic stories that I didn't include in the film. For example, there was this woman who gave up on the turn of, because they had basically 4 categories.
Yes.
First category was people that can help in the kibbutz and are in a very bad situation in Germany. Second category, people that are in bad situation in Germany but cannot help in the kibbutz, old, sick, whatever it is. Third category, people that can help in the kibbutz and the situation is okay. And the fourth category was people or parents that we will, you know, we will speak about them next year, because now their situation is good and we don't worry about them. only next year. This next year never came for these people. And there was one story that there was this woman and her parents were in the first in the first or second category, but she gave up on their turn to someone else, to her friend, because they already left Germany to the Czech Republic, not Czech Republic,
Czechoslovakia,
Czechoslovakia at the time. And a couple of, so she gave up. She was a good friend to her friend and gave the turn to her parents. And then the Nazis, you know, got into Prague, and the story ended. You know, these parents died. So basically, by giving her turn to someone else, she you know, she made a decision that in the end of the day, you know, she had to live with for the rest of her life, because her parents died, and as a result of her decision. So when you have this kind of situation, when you live in a kibbutz, there is this person who helped 10 or 15 parents, but could not help other 15 or 20. If I live in a place like that, I'm not gonna speak too much about him and then make him a hero, because he was a hero to my family, but for my neighbors, he was the last chance
Mhm.
to save their parents, and he couldn't save them.
Mhm.
So I think there was so much pain that they didn't want to speak about it. They didn't want to bring up his name and make it known, because it was painful for others.
Mhm.
The same situation happened in Israel, not only in the kibbutz. And I can tell you something, you know, when I was making the research and worked with Professor Moshe Zimmerman, one of the greatest experts in Israel for the Holocaust period, he told me, go and read what David Ben-Gurion said in 38 in December 8th, 1938. And I went and I read what he said. And what David Ben-Gurion said on that date, which is 1 week after the beginning of the Kindertransport, he's speaking in front of an audience and he's saying, I've just heard that trains are taking out children from Germany without their parents to England. If I would have two options, says David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, the father of Israel, yeah, the state of Israel. If I have two options, one is to rescue all the Jewish children with trains to England, and the other one is to rescue only half of them, but bring them here to Palestine, I have to take the second option.
Mhm.
Because the second option, because I don't only, I have to care not only for these poor children, but for the faith, or for the future of the whole Jewish people. So the situation was so complicated. And when you rescue people, you cannot rescue everyone. I could see it also in the letters of my grandfather, how much pain he had, that he had to say to people, no, I cannot help you. Come next month. Because the visas and the certificates were so limited. That's one reason why I think the story was untold. The second reason is that in order to rescue Jews from Germany in the 30s, you need to speak, negotiate, sometimes bribe the people that are in control of the borders, of the banks, of the trains, and those are the Nazis.
It's a gray zone. Yeah.
So you have to speak with them. And in Israel, in the 50s, if you know the story of Kastner.
Kastner, exactly.
And, you know, anyone that spoke with the devil was regarded as a betrayer. Like all our heroes in Israel are people that, you know, fought the Nazis, never spoke to them, but also never saved the soul. You know, Hannah Senesh, she's a big hero, but she never saved a soul. And when you don't save anyone, nobody asks you, why did you save him and you didn't save her? So I think this is the two main reasons why Story of Wilfrid Israel was kept untold. It was not a decision, but it was so complicated for people to touch it back in the days. And we had to have 3 generations, you know, pass until we can speak about it and say, yeah, it was not black and white.
Yeah. There
were actually, you know, Nazis that gave Wilfrid Israel very important information.
Yeah.
And it was not black and white. And everybody that was involved in this time, especially rescuing efforts like Wilfrid Israel, you know, wanted to keep it secret. I have to say that this is changing. For many, many years in Israel, there was no official, how do you say it? Officially, nobody spoke about Jews who saved Jews.
Oh, yes, yes.
It was a taboo.
Yeah.
you know, righteous among the nations. We have like 28,000 of them. All of them are non-Jews.
Yeah.
But nobody spoke about Jews who saved Jews. And in 2020, Yad Vashem, which is the most important organization for the memory of the Holocaust in Israel, the whole year was about Jews who saved Jews.
Yeah.
And Wilfrid Israel was in the front page. So this is changing, and I'm happy.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you,
very
Angela.
much. Thank you.
Brilliant question. We don't have much time left, but I am going to keep it open for another 10 minutes because we've got 2 questions, and I'm just going to take those 2 before we tie up, because I think it's important to give some space to our audience. So I know V. Ing, who I hope will introduce and tell us what their name is, has had their hand up for a while. Would you like to ask a question?
Hello. I tried to tell you my name is Monica, but
Ah,
I'm no good with technology. I'll be brief. First of all, thank you so much to Jono. Absolutely fascinating. But I must say, my heart is still broken, bringing the subject of refugees to now, to today, the 2nd of December. My heart is still broken at what happened when those 27 people, refugees, drowned in the English Channel. It has since come to light, as I'm sure everybody knows, that the whole situation was treated as a political football between the British, or should I say the English, and the French. These refugees, regardless, who cares about religion, etc. at this point, they phoned the British, or should I say the English, they phoned the French. Both sides said, you're on the wrong side of the border, and they drowned. It's not a question really, it's just getting it off my chest.
well, thank you, because I think it's something we're all feeling, and the more that these things are happening, the more all of us with any kind of connection to a refugee background, or even just Jewish with awareness of what happened in the Holocaust, there are so many parallels, and it is devastating again to see the English establishment as well as the French just pushing refugees away. As you know, as many people have said, you only get on one of those boats if the land is even less safe. You know, you only get a train leaving your parents behind to another country, stepping into the unknown, if you know that to stay at home would be, you know, it would be taking the risk of losing your whole life. You know, these are not decisions that people make willingly, and they make them when they have no other choices, where the only choice of survival is the choice to escape. And thank goodness, I'm speaking here from London, so thank goodness our country did let some in once for a while. But I think what the stories we're hearing from Yonatan and Jonathan show is that was because there was a huge amount of work being done by the scenes by people like Wilfrid Israel to really make that happen. It wasn't by English choice and activism, it was by the Jewish communities, European communities, and rescuers like Wilfrid Israel bringing people out. But you've made a connection, Monica, thank you. Which leads me to bring in for the last question and also comment our other Monica, because I know there are 2 things that I want to just mention that are really interesting. One is you've mentioned France, and I'm sure Jonathan will be able to share with us in a moment that one of the last things that Wilfrid Israel set in motion just before he died was trying to rescue children from Vichy as well. Oh, and thank you, Dave Beers, just put in the chat to me, and not to forget the Quakers. You know, it's people like Wilfrid Israel, and it is people like the Quakers, and I think that's really important. But so that connection with France that you brought up is really important. And the other place that Wilfrid Israel went to just before his death, which we'll maybe finish off with in a moment, was Portugal. And I know Monica wanted to say a little about that, as well as about other things that we've talked about this evening. So I'm going to add her in to take that on.
Thank you very much, Aviva. What a very, very rich and thought-provoking conversation it's been. And I don't want to keep people too long. And I will say something, don't let me forget, at the very end about the two next talks, which do indeed, the second one in particular, tie in with some of what's being talked about today. But I'd just like to pick up, if I may, first of all, on this question of unsung heroes and indeed heroines. The Kindertransport, it's obvious it couldn't have been done by one man or one woman alone. But I'd like to mention at least two other figures who haven't been mentioned today and who are rarely spoken about. One of them is a Dutch non-Jewish woman called Truus Weissmuller. I wonder, I'd love to do a kind of poll, how many people have heard of her. She actually talked to Eichmann, no less. Another murky, morally murky issue there, of course, raising its head. There has been work done on her. A new film, in fact, I think recently has come out by a Dutch filmmaker. The other person who I'm finding increasingly fascinating is a member of the illustrious Warburg family. And if I can just dwell on them for a moment, I'm in the process of plowing my way through a very, very fat and fascinating book of the whole history of that eminent dynastic Jewish dynasty, concentrating, I'm particularly interested in the war years. Felix and Max, I mean, yes, eminent people like Wilfrid Israel with connections in high places, and they weren't afraid or shy to use them. So I think I was very struck, Jonathan, by what you were saying about one reason perhaps why these figures are not sufficiently acknowledged for the role they played is that they did indeed consort with the enemy, if you like. But it had to be done. It had to be done. Lola is particularly interesting. She was the sister-in-law of Kurt Hahn, who was an important educationalist who set up Gordonstoun up in Scotland. But more importantly for our purposes, she had an affair with Chaim Weizmann and indeed knew Wilfrid Israel. I don't know, Yonatan, whether you've come across Lola, fascinating woman who then comes to this country, I think very late in the day, and does a great deal on the ground here to make the Kindertransport happen. So really, a really fascinating figure. And lastly, turning to the Quakers, absolutely. So important, rarely sufficiently acknowledged. The other issue I just wanted to end with is on a lighter note. In the film, you get a sense, a glimpse of that fantastic Far Eastern art collection. And given, the kind of commitment to art that Wilfrid obviously had, and I don't want to be rude to kibbutzim or to Israel at all, but it slightly mystifies me that he should have chosen to donate that clearly very, very magnificent collection to a kibbutz, perhaps knowing that it would not be seen by as wide a public as it ought to be. And Jonathan, also, I'm an art historian, so I can't help asking you. You talked about your father and your grandfather, and I think I know what their first names were, but can you please tell us their first names so we can go away and do some more homework? Jonathan, maybe first, just tell us.
Shall we do Jonathan first, and then we'll finish with Yonatan talking about Wilfrid's art?
My grandfather was Joseph Oppenheimer.
I thought so.
And my father was Hans, but changed his name to John when he came to England.
So nothing to do with Siegfried, because there's a Siegfried Oppenheimer as well. No.
No. There was an Oppenheimer painter in Scotland whose first name
Charles, I think. Charles,
and who used to irritate my grandfather greatly because they went to the same framer. Their painting style was extremely different, and but the framer was sometimes stupid enough to send the wrong paintings back to the wrong painter.
I'd love to talk to you sometime, perhaps, about doing an event about your father and grandfather. Anyway, yes, on this question of Wilfrid as a collector, maybe you'd like Jonathan to say something.
Well, he made the decision to he donated the art collection to the kibbutz. It's a great museum, actually. You're most welcome to come and visit. for many years, the historical story, even in the museum, you know, you would go to the museum and there was not a sign, you know, to the historical story. It was the only sign that we had in the entrance, you know, was Wilfrid Israel was a philanthropist, and he was a good friend of the founders of the kibbutz. That's all that they wrote on the sign at the entrance to the museum. But today it's different. Today, when people come to the museum, they see the short version of this film, and they appreciate not only the beautiful art collection, but also the amazing life story of this man. And I think it's connected. I think that the fact that he was so attracted to Buddhism, to pacifism, to Eastern philosophies is, you know, is not a mistake. You know, he was that what really attracted him. All his beautiful Buddhas that he has in his art collection in the kibbutz. I think he was himself inspired by this kind of philosophies. By the way, there was a burglary in the museum a couple of months ago. People came in at night and broke some beautiful beautiful pieces from his art collection. And it made a big noise in Israel. And the only thing I can say is that there are more visitors right now, and more people know about him. So, you know, like the Mona Lisa became famous because it was stolen. So maybe when sometimes people steal and make ugly things, but then it's going on the press, and then more and more people know about Wilfrid. And I think the most important thing is his values, you know, the values that he left behind him, caring about the poor, caring about the people that has no representation, caring about others, trying to help as much as he can, and just be a human being, you know. I related to what someone said before about refugees in other places around the world, which is a problem everywhere. And I hope Wilfrid Israel and people like him will inspire us and will inspire our leaders to behave to each other better, and especially to people that are going through hardships and difficult times.
I couldn't agree more. Here, absolutely. Thank you, Yonatan. So perhaps, Aviva, shall I just round up by telling people of the other goodies in store? We have two more events in this Spies, Lies and Secret Missions series, two very different ones, but that actually link up in different ways with the previous events. The first one next Thursday, also at 8 o'clock, is about a fascinating, and I suspect to most of you totally unknown, female graphic designer and typographer called Elisabeth Friedlander. German born, in fact, I think Berlin, but don't quote me on that, who became involved when she came over to this country via Italy in British wartime black propaganda. The format of the event is going to be the showing of a short, what's often called an essay film. I think, Yonatan, you'll probably know what I mean. It's not a documentary in the traditional sense. It's a rather poetic kind of, almost a rumination on the life and legacy of this remarkable woman, Elisabeth Friedlander, by a youngish filmmaker called Catherine Meynell, who comes from the eminent Meynell family. Frances Meynell, maybe a familiar name to some of you, who actually helped Elisabeth when she came to this country. And taking part in the conversation with the director will be Julia Weiner, who some of you will know as a very good and eloquent art critic and a specialist, in fact, in the emigre designers. So that should be a really rich and interesting event. The last one in our series, just before Christmas, is on the 16th, also at 8 o'clock. And this is where I have to say that I think, Aviva, we did talk about whether to insert the word Jewish in the title of our series. And yes, I think what I'm about to say is the exception that proves the rule, but the hero of our last session, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, was not Jewish, he was Catholic, and I have to say, perhaps rather disrespectfully, that I think he had about 17 children, so that's entirely by the way, but he was a remarkable man. He was obviously, part of his commitment to humanity was, I think, born of his own profound religious beliefs, but he was Portuguese. He was the Portuguese ambassador in Bordeaux in France, and I think Yehuda Bauer has described his help given to refugees as perhaps the greatest, most single-handed escape attempt, or successful escape attempt in the whole history of the Second World War. And we're lucky to have on board for that event several people connected with the Aristides de Sousa Mendes Foundation, which is now in the USA. And indeed, as well as talking about his life and legacy, there will be some discussion about the artworks in various different media that have been done in response to his extraordinary story. So much to look forward to.
Thank you,
Monica. Can I just ask a question?
Of course.
You know, in Bordeaux, I mean, the fact that this person was called Aristides is really interesting. The one of the chief SOE operatives in Bordeaux was a man whose nom de guerre, or his code name, was Aristide, who was a French Jew whose family were furriers, and his parents come to England, and he, I think, remained initially in France studying architecture, but eventually came to England, went into the army, was going to be a signaller, and was picked out to go into SOE, and he had a very, very dramatic career in Bordeaux. And all this came to light when he died, and somebody discovered, he lived in a house called Aristide, and you don't know about this.
I'm obviously extremely intrigued. Come along in 2 weeks' time and tell us that, and let's see whether we can elicit a response that would be useful. Now, how fascinating, indeed.
And just to follow up from that, because the way I wanted to end tonight was, I wanted to, first of all, give huge thanks to Jonathan and to Yonatan for joining us, for sharing the film with us. And for those who haven't yet watched it, please do go away and watch the link. And we're so grateful for your making that and for your time tonight to introduce us to Wilfrid Israel. And I wanted to actually finish in reading the letter that Albert Einstein wrote to Wilfrid's mother on Wilfrid's death, or when Wilfrid's death was suspected. But I think in context of what Monica and Jonathan have just said, I should probably emphasize the way that Wilfrid died was that in March 1943, he left London for Portugal, for Lisbon, where he spent a couple of months working to distribute certificates of entry and visas to British ruled Palestine, to Jewish refugees, and investigating the situation of the Jews on the peninsula. And that's when he also kind of formulated the plans to support and get out Jewish children from Vichy. So it ties in Vichy France, so it ties in on both connections. But on the 1st of June, he got a BA flight back, or he tried to, and it was actually shot down over the Bay of Biscay by 8 German junkers. So, I mean, that's, to me, overkill, right? They definitely were targeting that plane, and there is a question about who they were targeting on that plane, but very likely it was Wilfrid Israel. Wilfrid Israel's body was never found. So the assumption is that it seems obvious that he did die on that day on the Bay of Biscay, but that it left the family not quite knowing what had happened to him. So I'm just going to finish before I close the Zoom by reading the letter that Einstein wrote to Mrs. Israel in June 1943 when he heard the news. Dear Mrs. Israel, a deep desire prompts me to write to you, as I know your great anxiety regarding the fate of your son. Never in my life have I come in contact with a being so noble, so strong, and as selfless as he was, in very truth, a living work of art. In these times of mass misfortune, which so few are able to stand up to, one feels the presence of this chosen one as a liberator from despair for mankind. I dare yet to hope that through a miracle he's been spared to us, yet it urges me, though so helpless, to assure you of my deepest sympathy in these most tragic hours. With heartfelt wishes, Albert Einstein. I thought that note of the being so noble, so strong and so selfless was a really important eulogy, a chesed to Wilfrid Israel. And I hope we'll all take his memory with us as we go into the evening and let it bring a little bit of light, like the Hanukkah candles, to these dark nights and dark times. So thank you so much to everybody. Hanukkah Sameach, and we hope to see you again in the next couple of weeks.